makes us who we are? What are the driving forces behind our personality? There are a wide variety of theories about what makes up our personality, dating all the way back to Sigmund Freud. Today, we're going to take a look at two of the older theories of personality, the psychodynamic or Freudian approach and the humanist approach to personality. So let's start first with the psychodynamic approach. Again, this was the theory that was originally proposed by Sigmund Freud. And the psychodynamic perspective believes that there are a lot of unconscious processes involved in our personality. And what we mean by unconscious processes is that we are not always aware of what motivates us and what drives our behavior. However, these can be seen through what are known as ego defense mechanisms. So in order to understand defense mechanisms, let's first talk about what is the ego and what are the parts of personality according to Freud. Freud believed that the mind was like an iceberg, made up of parts that are seen and unseen, and that the id, ego, and superego are the parts of the mind that make up our personality. The id is unconscious, and it is the I do what I want part of our personality. It is driven by pleasure and enjoyment and the things that we want to do. You can think of it like the devil on one shoulder. The superego is the angel on the other shoulder. It is what tells us what we should do. It is our conscience, something that we develop as time goes on. And the ego is the self. Whatever we choose to do, whichever part of our personality we choose to listen to or try to maintain a balance between them, that is going to be acted upon by the ego. So defense mechanisms are something that the ego use in order to help satisfy the id without going against our superego's conscience. So it's a way to reduce anxiety by distorting reality in some way. So when the id wants to act out in some way that is considered not socially acceptable, the superego won't allow us to, and so the ego has created these defense mechanisms as a way to allow us to channel that energy into something that is more socially acceptable. The first defense mechanism is quite simple, and it is denial, right? So we are just refusing to accept or acknowledge that unpleasant reality, that thing that is causing us to feel anxiety. Displacement is redirecting that impulse onto something that is more socially acceptable or a less threatening target. So let's say a parent yells at you and you can't yell back because your superego won't allow it. Instead, you might take that anger out on a sibling or a pillow, something that is more socially acceptable or something less threatening that allows you to redirect that anger because you can't direct it at the person that originally caused it. Projection is taking a threatening impulse you have about yourself and projecting it onto others. So let's say you have an insecurity of some kind, maybe about the way that you look, for example. Someone using projection might then look for the flaw in others and point it out constantly as a way to make themselves feel better and not feel so alone in that trait that they have. Or someone who likes to gossip a lot might be the first person who calls someone else out on it in order to make themselves feel better. Projection is often being a bit hypocritical. It's a way of taking those insecurities that we have and placing them on other people to feel better. Rationalization is justifying behavior, coming up with a fake but plausible explanation for our behavior when we can't be honest about why we're doing what we're doing. For example, someone who loses their job might have to sell their car because they can no longer afford it. They might tell people that the reason they got this new car is because it is better for the environment or some other socially acceptable reason in order to justify their behavior. Reaction formation is a defense mechanism where someone makes an impulse appear its opposite. So when someone is faced with a person they don't like, for example, they might smile and give them compliments in order to hide their true feelings. Regression is a defense mechanism of retreating to an earlier stage of development. So when faced with a bad day or receiving disappointing news, someone might retreat to a childlike state, throwing a temper tantrum, going up into their room, curling into a ball, and crying might be the way that they deal with it, going to an earlier stage of life where someone else, like a parent or caregiver, was responsible for their problems and taking care of them when they were in a time of distress or need. And repression is a defense mechanism of pushing those thoughts from our unconscious minds. So pushing them into our unconscious so that we simply don't have to deal with them. According to Freud, though, sometimes those repressed ideas bubble their way back up to the surface, and that's where they might cause us some problems. And sublimation is taking an unacceptable impulse and channeling it into something socially acceptable. So this would be, for example, taking that aggression and channeling it into sports. Someone who gets in a lot of fights at school, who becomes a world-class boxer, goes from being punished for hitting others to now being praised for doing so. Someone who's bullied might take their bully's traits and turn them into characters in a novel that they write that then becomes a best-selling book. That is taking that unacceptable impulse and channeling it into something socially acceptable. So all of these are part of Freud's personality theory. When we see people exhibiting these behaviors, it's the unconscious mind that is the driving force behind our personality. There are other things we can do to try and get into our unconscious mind, such as projective tests. These are things like the Rorschach inkblot tests, where you look at an image that is ambiguous, that description is then some kind of reflection of your own personality. We also have our preconscious mind, which are those items that are below the surface but can be easily retrieved. And some of those can be pulled out using those projective tests. And then last but not least, we also have the humanist theory of personality. While there's not as much to this as the psychodynamic perspective, humanism was considered the third force in psychology that came after the psychodynamic and the behaviors perspectives, going from the internal and the external forces that drive our behavior to now looking at our potential for growth. Humanists believe that we have this ability to become self-actualized, to fulfill our potential and have these subjective experiences. The way that we do that, what motivates us, according to humanists, is having unconditional positive regard and self-actualizing tendencies. Unconditional regard is an attitude of acceptance towards another person. So when we have an environment where people accept us for who we are more likely to accept ourselves and therefore able to fulfill our potential. And that fulfilling of our potential is our self-actualizing tendency. What motivates and drives our behavior, according to humanists, is the ability to become self-actualized, the ability to fulfill our potential. And as long as we have the right environment, including an environment of unconditional positive regard, we should have the ability to do so. So consider how these two theories fit into either your own behaviors or the behaviors that you see of others around you, and see when you can identify when a defense mechanism might be used or when someone is trying to fulfill their potential by making sure that their other needs are met. Or consider how you try to fulfill your own potential and reach those self-actualizing tendencies. But these really are just two theories of personality in the field of psychology. Next up, we're going to take a look at more modern explanations of what makes us who we are. So thank you so much for watching, and as always remember, be kind to your mind.